About 20 seconds.
About 20 seconds.
No memory card. Okay. It's okay. Oh, put it in A. It's probably in the wrong slide. It's in B.
So, hello, my name is Dr. Meredith. I'm the Director of K-12 Research on the Advocacy team at UNCF, and we are excited to have you here for our panel. Our session title is Strengthening the Black Educator Pipeline. So, of course, at UNCF, you know that we're committed to getting students to and through college and successful careers, and we know that really starts with a high-quality K-12 education. And that education should include diverse, highly qualified Black teachers. But sadly, we know nationwide, only 70% of teachers are Black, and 11% of clinical principals are African American as well. But we know they have benefits for all students, not only Black students. So consider a couple of these stats. Black teachers decrease the presence of Black students receiving exclusionary discipline. Schools with larger numbers of Black teachers or Black principals have a greater representation of Black students in gifted classes. Black teacher expectations for Black students are about 30 to 40% higher than non-Black teachers. Black students, who have just one Black teacher by the third grade are 13% more likely to enroll in college. And as our forthcoming research will show, we conducted research with African American parents. Black parents whose children attend schools with more Black teachers are less likely to report exclusionary discipline for their children, more likely to agree that their school does a better job offering cultural and racial lesson plans. And they also, when Black parents have more Black teachers in school for their students, they're to represent Juneteenth on the Black History Month program. But they're the disruptors in an education system that often devalues them. And the work that they do for our children is not only revolutionary, but it's transformational. And so we know that HBCUs are critical to diversifying this teacher and their work. So today we're really going to delve into that more deeply, but then talk about the role that HBCUs play in creating this diverse pipeline. So today for the panel we have Sekou, who's our VP for Advocacy and Student Professional Development Program, that's going to moderate the panel for us. And I'll just give a little bio on Sekou. So Sekou leads our advocacy efforts at UNCF to ensure more African American students will be college ready and better prepared to understand advocacy. But he's been director at HBCUs and Teach for America. He has a bachelor's degree in business from Morehouse College and a master's education degree in early childhood education from Georgia State University. So it looks like that.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I think we didn't get mentioned in the intro is the research Dr. Anderson has been leading for has been hugely helpful in helping us understand the nature of what's going on in K-12 education in the country, and part of why we're here for this conversation here today. So thank you for all of that work and for pulling together this panel. I'm looking forward to having a great conversation with our panelists today, and then we're going to make some time to invite all of you all to this conversation as well. So any questions you have during the course of the conversation, please write them down, and we'll make sure to get to as many of the audience questions as we can. So we take a little bit more about myself in terms of why this particular topic came to me, and then some of the work that we've been doing. So I've been with UNCF now. I know many of you I've met in the last 2 years where I've actually not seen you in person. And thank you to everyone for giving up their time, their energy, and being here today to be a part of this conversation and the conference in general. It's great to see so many people committed to educational equity and improvement for African Americans in particular here together. So in the last 10 years, we've been doing a lot of work at UNCF to figure out what can we do as a leader in Black education, in particular in the HBCU sector, to improve educational outcomes for Black students. And one of the things we learned, I mean, UNCF has been doing a lot of work for 77 years. One of the things we've learned is that one of the principal challenges to a lot of Black students getting a college degree is actually not getting prepared for college in K-12, and then also not, frankly, being inspired to or informed on how to go to college. I'll tell you honestly, I'm of the belief that, like, if you are college interested and proximate to college ready, like, a good college can get you through. The problem is if you don't have any interest, knowledge, or readiness that you should be going to college, it becomes harder for college to really change your life. I think that those of us who have college going in our family and personal experience can testify to the importance of a life-changing experience. I'm also, as Meredith mentioned, a Morehouse graduate, and both my parents went to HBCUs, so I think that I have a personal perspective on the power of HBCUs to both get young people ready for success in careers in life, but also to sort of, frankly, get them ready for the realities of the world that we actually live in. We're still all working every day to make the world better, but I think we have to be real about the way the world is. I think the HBCUs do and have for decades done the really hard work of helping African American students get prepared for the realities of the world they're going to face after college. And so we have looked at, okay, K-12 has to do more and better to help young people be ready for college. It's got to do more to inspire them to go to college. And part of that, as Mary pointed out in research, is who's in the classrooms and the school buildings there to do that. Because a lot of the experiences actually trickle down to just simply who's in the building. What are the role models students are taking away from the people that are in the building with them. And so we've actually been doing a good amount of work on this. We've researched parent perspectives on what it is they want for their children in schools. We've gotten perspectives from African American leaders about what they'd like to see improving education. We've heard even directly from students about what is it that's happening in K-12 that's helping them and what do they need more of to prepare them for success. Additionally, and we're going to hear a little more about this today, I'm excited to hear more about the legacy of this work. We've been running a fellowship program for a little over a decade that's been helping African American and HBCU students experience many of the opportunities that are in the K-12 education sector, and that's both in the public sector through government and through schools, but also in the nonprofit sector to help more young people realize that there's a lot of opportunity for them out there in helping to transform and improve K-12 education. Some of that is in classrooms, some of that's in leadership in K-12 schools, and some of it's in other parts of the K-12 world, and some of our panelists are going to talk about the work that they do that's really important in that space as well. And we've seen innovation in the HBCU sector on teachers as well. Some of you are familiar with the Norman C. Francis Teacher Residency Program that was uniquely designed to meet the needs of New Orleans specifically, and its need to get more people ready to be successful teachers of students in New Orleans, and so the unique perspective and needs for the students there. And then I think some of you all probably familiar with this, we are now launching an initiative at UNCF with HBCUs across the country to build more teacher pipelines and pathways, particularly for Black teachers and HBCUs, to help get more young people into the space. And I think, as I'll talk to some of you all about, some of that we believe requires taking some non-traditional approaches, building some programs and opportunities that will help young people explore, figure out the right way in for them. Not everyone's path into the classroom is the same. I started my career as a teacher corps member in the very early years, and then started a career and taught for a decade in elementary schools. And I know a lot of people who start through traditional pathways. Full disclosure, I'm the chair of the board of urban teachers that runs the teacher residency program in Dallas, because I have somebody from the area, in Dallas and in Fort Worth, Texas, as well as Baltimore, DC, and we're launching in Philadelphia. So I think that there are a lot of different ways to do this, and we want to be encouraging of more institutions, more people to explore the variety of paths in, and then to help all the young people figure out what's the right way for me to learn more about the way into a career in K-12 education. So with that said, I'm looking forward to having a conversation with our panelists. And so I'm taking a minute to do brief introductions of our panelists, and then we will get in. See the next one. So I'm going to work from my right. So my immediate left is far left. State, and will obtain her specialist degree in the same area from Berry College at the end of June 2020. Congratulations. She is married with 2 sons and self-proclaimed true crime buff. She's also a member of the inaugural UNCF K-12 fellowship program, which we'll hear more about today. Thank you for being with us here today, Rachel. I'm also a parent of 2 sons, so we commiserate on the good and bad of that sometimes. Steen Lyles leads DonorsChoose efforts to incorporate a race equity forward lens in supporting students and teachers across the country. She led the creation of #ICMe, a DonorsChoose initiative, ensuring that students see themselves reflected in their teachers and in their learning environments, as well as unique insights, unique impact. The largest survey ever centering male teachers of color. Steen also collaborates with companies and foundations committed to racial equity in public schools, and is especially passionate about growing relationships with philanthropists of color, hoping to make an impact for students and teachers. Prior to joining DonorsChoose, Steen practiced corporate law. Before that, she taught street law to high school students in the DC public school system. Steen graduated from Spelman College and Georgetown Law, and loves all things related to cheerleading, dance, Atlanta, and coffee. Steen is the proud mama of 2 little humans and a rescue pup. Sharif El-Mekki. Sharif is the founder and CEO of the Center for Black Educator Development. Prior to founding the center, Sharif served as a nationally recognized principal and U.S. Department of Education Principal Ambassador Fellow. His school, Mastery Charter Shoemaker, was recognized by President Obama and Oprah Winfrey, and was awarded the prestigious EPIC Award for 3 consecutive years as being among the top 3 schools in the country for accelerating students' achievement levels. In 2014, Sharif founded the Fellowship Black Male Educator through Social Justice, an organization dedicated to recruiting, retaining, and developing black male teachers. Sharif blogs as Philly's 7th Ward, is a member of the 8 Black Hands podcast, which, if you are at all into podcasts, you should subscribe to. Great podcast. And serves on several boards and committees focused on educational and racial justice. And last but not least, my fellow UNCF colleague, Dr. Keeley Copridge. Keeley is a senior associate for UNCF's Frederick Douglass Patterson Research Institute. Before joining UNCF, Keeley worked as a project associate for Indiana University's Office of Vice Provost for undergraduate education and the Center for Post-Secondary Research on research projects examining underrepresented students and engagement experiences. Keeley is a first-generation college graduate who obtained her BA in Psychology and Master's of Science in Social Work at the University of Louisville, Kentucky. She's currently enrolled in the Higher Education Doctoral Program at Indiana University, where she will defend her dissertation examining the college choice experience of Black college women in December 20, I don't know if I have it wrong or if I read it wrong. All right, so those are our panelists. Looking forward to hearing lots from them today. What was that, Keeley?
Oh, no, history.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then she defended her dissertation in December 2020. Okay, so why don't we, and just so we can keep each other honest here, why don't we agree to do about, what do we say, 30-ish minutes of questions, and then we'll get a reminder for you all, and we'll transition to your questions. So I'm going to take a little bit of a slight jog to the left here about panelists, so I apologize for going off script right out of the gate. But I'd love actually for everyone to take a minute or two to tell us a little about your personal experiences growing up with Black teachers in schools. So who would like to jump in first? Keeley, you like your ready.
Yes, Miss Buckner, 5th grade. She was in charge of spelling at Morningside Elementary School. I was not a very good speller whatsoever, but she had extremely high expectations for me because I went to detention a couple times. She had a high expectations for the Black students and all of the students, but particularly the Black students at Morningside. And so I remember, her working with me with my spelling and reading it together, and also my enunciating and everything else, making sure that I was prepared for work. Definitely Miss Buckner. So.
I can go. So I grew up on Long Island in New York, and I actually did not have a Black teacher until I went to Spelman. That was my first time having a person before me educating me that looked like me. I believe a lot of that is because growing up, being gifted and being an AP, right, those teachers in that area in New York are typically Caucasian, and so I didn't have the experience. I think maybe my track coach was Black, and then other than that, I didn't have it in K through 12. And so it is really important to me to have these conversations and to talk about the recruitment of Black teachers, especially in those areas, so that not only students who live in predominantly Black areas can see someone in the classroom that looks like them.
That really resonates too, because when I think about, for me, business is personal since I'm in the racial equity space too, but both my parents are teachers, both of them graduated from HBCUs, but the person that I consider the most influential in my education was my dad's mom, so my grandmother, who, was rural South Carolina. She didn't graduate from high school. She had a 3rd grade education. I didn't know until after she passed away that she couldn't read or write, because I thought we were reading together, but I realized as a kid I was like reading with grandma. But I think about her now, which is like the power of like seeing yourself in your teacher was real, because I would see my parents go off and teach, but then for me, my first teacher that was a Black woman was kindergarten, and I think it took till about 12th grade. And so I saw another one, but every single time I was like looking for grandma to make sure that someone could kind of nestle next to me, like nice and robust, and like we could read. And so yeah, I think about grandma as like the best teacher that I ever had, and I look for moments to make sure that we think about education very differently than perhaps we might otherwise.
I had the opposite. I had one white teacher until 10th grade in high school. So my elementary school was a kind of a freedom school experience. Started by parents in someone's house, and then evolved into brick and mortar. And they were just all not only pro-Black, but they were all revolutionaries and activists, and they didn't separate education from activism. And so that was just like the ecosystem we all grew up in, and that continues to color my perspective of education today. But they had that type of impact.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I thought about this actually last night when I was sort of reading through, getting ready, because it occurred to me, and this is really helpful, because a lot of times when we think about the stats around, teachers in schools, we hear the numbers, which, are the numbers in aggregate. What we don't necessarily get is a picture of what might be happening in a given school or another. And I think that sometimes we actually have the extremes happening that, you know, you hear about single-digit percentages. Well, but for some students, that might actually mean, you know, there are some black students that don't have black teachers. And there are others, you know, because I think, Sharif, your experience is much more like what I had growing up. Was, you know, and I grew up in DC public schools in the 70s and 80s. And overwhelmingly, the teachers in the schools I went to were black, which was interesting in part because the schools I attended were neighborhood schools in predominantly white neighborhoods. But the teaching staff and principals were almost entirely black in those schools, which had a lot to do with, like, you know, the demographics of DC and what had happened as a function of, you know, desegregation of the school system, you know, years before. But I think that oftentimes, right, we can get sort of caught in our experience is the experience other people had. And I remember getting to Morehouse and having classmates who said, like, this is the first time I've been somewhere where either the majority of students or the majority of teachers are both black. And I'm like, what? And I think that, you know, it can be hard to, like, wrap our heads around. There are such different realities out there. And I think part of the task is, you know, how do we create an environment in which there's a greater black teacher supply, but also distributed in all the different places where black children are today. So I can jump right into that and sort of hear from you all your thinking around, so what do you feel like the best practices are right now in recruiting black teachers and principals into schools, and tell us a little about your personal perspective on that.
So I would say one of the most important things that I would think is the first to start at HBCUs, right, and black student unions of other schools. But then even before that, going into high schools and educating people on what teaching actually is. I say that because when I decided I wanted to be a teacher, it wasn't until I was at Spelman I changed my major. And the first thing I remember my parents saying to me was, they always push black people into the service positions. So my mom was against me, you know, being a teacher or a nurse because she felt like those were the things that they push upon black people. And so I think that there's a misconception about what teaching is and why African Americans in teaching positions is important. And I think if we start in high school and kind of curve people's opinion and their desire of what they want to do into that, I think we'll have a lot more people then declaring education as a major when they get into school and being able to then recruit them out of school. I also think that having people understand how important their presence is, right? So not necessarily making someone feel like, okay, well, I'm going to recruit you here and you're going to be our token, you know, African American, but we need to be a multicultural education, you know, institute, and we need you here for these purposes, letting people understand why their presence is important.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that wholeheartedly. A big part of our work is engaging high school students, college students, to explore teaching and help them see the connection between educational justice and racial justice. And then that exposure as well is how they reimagine education, particularly if they didn't have black teachers, right? Like if they only see white women, they may not see themselves. But I think another side of recruitment is a really strong, robust retention plan. And I think a lot of districts are running around, they find recruitment sexy. Many of them are approaching it almost as if they're on a safari. Look at that magical Negro, how do we get them into our district or school? When it should really be, how do we, you know, what's the retention, what's the ecosystem? And how do we make sure, as a part of the retention, which is kind of the best recruitment plan, right? Like those black educators will be ambassadors to others, but if they're leaving, particularly because they have a whole lot of colleagues who are anti-black, then that's sending a message and it's broadcasting like this is not a safe space for potential black educators. So what that means and how we communicate in the at the black water cooler, whether it's water cooler, dining room table, or black Twitter for that matter, what's being received by other folks will help with recruitment in itself.
So in the study I'm focusing on, which is on HBCUs, teacher education programs, there are formal and informal best practices that are being implemented to recruit. Formalized practices is a focus on paraprofessionals. There are quite a few teaching assistants, quite a few parents that are actively engaged with the school, and so many of the faculty, staff, the teacher education faculty and staff go and say, hey, you're doing an amazing job, did you know you can do this? And so what they then talk about is the alternative teaching, the Master's of Arts in Teaching programs as a way to recruit them into the teaching field. Some of the informal is, many of the faculty and staff, when they intentionally step outside of their home, they are a walking billboard for teacher education. And what I mean by that, they are very intentional about wearing their t-shirts. When they are at a football game with their child, when they're at a soccer game with their child, they're intentional having their business cards there to say, hey, parent, you are very engaged in your child's life. Have you thought about being a teacher? So for them, the recruiting, it never stops, right? Because every opportunity for them to get in front of a face of someone who may be interested in it, that's their opportunity to speak on it. From a high school standpoint, from my study, many of them many high schools have future teachers associations. So they have created partnerships with the high schools to invite juniors and seniors to their campus to let them know and gain insight about the life of being a teacher. But the recruitment from an informal and an informal standpoint, it never stops at these institutions. So.
And I imagine too, I get excited too thinking about a couple of folks I'm in college with, a couple of cheermate this year. So I think about HBCUs, they're not Black versions of predominantly white institutions, right? They are created for students of color, they're created for Black students. I think the same for recruitment programs, right? Tailoring a different and unique approach to getting Black educators in the door is really important. And when I think about one, I imagine later we'll talk about the study that we launched for Black male educators, and we worked closely together on that. But one of the universal findings that was not race specific or even gender specific was a universal finding that having a great teacher inspires the kid to want to become one. So we looked across every platform. Is it gender? Is it race? Is it Latino educators? And across the board it was, what inspires you to want to become a teacher? I had great one. And so I imagine there's something too, actually just creating great educators is an internal platform for more, evangelism in the classroom to bring folks on to become teachers.
Hey, Steen, that's really interesting. And so, it made me think of, my first day teaching, as a PS65 in South Bronx, New York City, staying outside on the playground to pick up all the kids. And so they have all the classes lined up, and it's old school New York City. We've got size, place, order, boys and girls line, standing there. And so the kids are standing there, I walk in the front of the line. This little girl looks up at me, she goes, are you gonna be my teacher? It's like, yes I am. She said, you're the first man teacher I ever had. This is, 7 years of New York City public school. I was like, and this is funny because I'm thinking I've thought through everything, I'm ready for it, and I'm like, God, we haven't walked in the building yet, and this kid's already throwing curveballs at me. So I'd be curious, you pick up and talk a little bit more about the research you all have done, particularly on male educators. What are some of the things you think are really important people to know, or perhaps some things that are perhaps less obvious that you all want people to know about how we really turn the dial on increasing the number of male educators in space?
Yeah. So I should share at the outset. So if folks don't know DonorsChoose, our mission is to get resources into public school classrooms. And so we believe that where a student lives, nor their race should dictate whether or not they have access to books or go to classrooms or field trips or whatever. So part of the way that we built out our platform is that teachers come to our site and they create a classroom project, but we began to build out as a part of our racial equity strategy. If you were to come to our site as a teacher and create a project, we now say, hey, by the way, tell us your race, tell us your gender identity, tell us where you went to college. And that has allowed us now to have, over the course of our 20 years in the organization, the past 3 years, we have a database of about 500,000 teachers who have shared that information, and 100,000 teachers of color. So all that is background to the scale at which we can ask teachers a simple question to learn and get a pulse on what's happening across the ed space. And so we launched this study, and Sharif and I have partnered really closely on this, basically trying to figure out what is it that's unique about the male teacher of color experience. But the findings were most distinct for Black male educators.
educators. So I'll just sprinkle like 2 findings on, which were, we found that Black male teachers reported spending on average 4.6 hours a week tutoring students, 5.4 hours mentoring students outside of class, and that is more than any other demographic. We also found that even those teachers who reported spending more time with students outside of class, it did not affect their feelings of burnout. So they weren't saying, I'm more burnt out for having more students in my class, or I'm not more burnt out for spending more time outside of class tutoring and mentoring. In fact, I'm slightly less burnt out. There's something about this as a Black male educator that feels right. And then HBCU graduates reported the most engagement of all. They had more students in their classrooms, they had more hours spent tutoring, and more hours spent counseling than any other demographic, which, I mean, we were excited to share that with the team at UNCF because it really shows across tens of thousands of educators. We're talking about a unique finding showing the real power of teachers who graduated from HBCUs being really impactful in the classroom.
I mean, it does a lot explaining my first 2 years in New York City, like why I spent all this time. Like it wasn't that I had some genius ideas, just something about the experience we all had. This is what the kids were doing. It also explains why several of my roommates were constantly choking students around to all parts of the city to show them all manner of things. So, yeah, I think that's interesting, and I'd love to actually dig in a little bit on some of the perspectives from some of the educators here on the panel, so Sharif, Steen, and Rachel. You know, I'd love to learn a little bit more about the learning environments you think that Black educators are creating for their students and how those are different and potentially even more affirming. I know Sharif, I know you all are working on a new report about how they're creating affirming environments. So I'd love for you guys to talk a little more about that. Why don't we start with Rachel and we'll come back down to Sharif and Steen.
Sure. So I think the first thing is that our presence, even before we open our mouth, affirms students who look like us, right? So there's an immediate sense of trust when you know that your education is in the hand of someone who potentially has had the same experience that you have had. I think that we tend to lead by example, and I say that because, as you heard, I've taught 4th and 5th, and I've taught 4th and 5th for a reason. I like the older students so that I can connect with them. And I am completely honest with them about how I was in high school and my college experience, and letting them know that, like, you see me as a teacher now, but I wasn't always this way. Let me connect with you, and you're struggling with behavior. I struggle with behavior. Your family may be struggling with finances. I struggle with finances. Let's connect on that way. And I think that's a little different than some other educators. Like, we kind of connect with our students on that older sister, auntie, mom type of, dimension versus I'm your teacher and you're my student. So I think that is important. And then I feel like it creates a safe space for students to talk about, like, confronting history and what they're learning about history, and then what also is going on in current events. And they have a safe space to kind of relay their concerns and, like, what they're seeing, and have that back and forth conversation versus feeling like, okay, if I say this, is it going to seem racist? Or if I say this, is someone going to tell me that I'm just, imagining it? So I think that just our presence in general is extremely important to give students a space to be themselves, and then to see themselves in someone that has gone through what they've gone through.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, a part of that presence is also, providing protection. And a lot of times we talk about children's safety or student safety, and, first thing that people think about is, physical safety, which is obviously super important. But just as important is cultural, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual safety that Black educator can represent. And the violence that students experience, we know that the studies show that Black children as early as 3 and 4 years old, so Head Start, pre-K, experience their teachers' racial biases. Another way to think about that is they're subjected to racial violence, intellectually, culturally, emotionally, spiritually, as young as 3 and 4 years old. And so if you have an educator who is conscious of that, and also looks at that child as one of them, like I am you and you are me, as opposed to, well, you're a student, but I don't have a deeper connection to you. When you think about 80% of public school teachers are white, and the vast majority will, and over half of the students are students of color, how many white teachers only experience an interaction with students is within the school and it's with a child. That's their only experience, whether it's Facebook page, roommates, classmates, neighbors. Their only experience with this community is within the school. And so, like, who helps them bridge that? It sure isn't teacher prep programs in the traditional sense. It's not the PD that they're experiencing within the school. So where do they, investigate, interrogate, and excavate the racial biases that they've been subjected to on media, from their teachers, and at their dining room tables?
So it's going back to what you said about connecting culturally. I think about a time I was, when I first started teaching, I was working at a 21st century program in Atlanta, and the school was changing, and so the demographics looked a little bit different. And I remember, so I'm West Indian, my mom is Jamaican, and my dad is Asian. And so the little girl was calling her classmates picnic, right? I'm of course not saying it right, but that's what she was saying. And the teachers were in uproar. Like, they thought that she was saying like a racial term, and she was like cursing at them, and it was this whole thing, and I had to be like, wait, like that is a term that they use or we use in our culture. But I can't imagine, like, if she didn't have someone to defend her, verbiage or what, her culture was, like how that could have turned out. Especially, like I said, because it was at a time where the demographics of that school were changing over. And so I think there was already a lot of tension in the room and tension in the space. So yeah, that brought that to mind when you were saying protection culturally.
Yeah. And on the other side, I think about how many, we often talk about who's leading the classroom, but it's also who trained that teacher to lead the classroom. It's who's creating the policies within the school, who's the instructional coach for that teacher, right? And then who's publishing materials, right? And so if we know that Black children are more likely to see a talking bear or a talking rock than a character that looks like them, right? Then who's mitigating for that? Is the Black teacher that's supplementing and saying like, hey, that's crap, here's what I'm adding, right? And if somebody's just wholly unaware, they're not supplementing anything. If anything, they double down it. They're going to double down on that and say, yeah, you know what, like, and basically telling children, Black children, you're stowaways to this American thing. You're not actually participants and contributors to society, civilization, etc., because they have no context of the actual history of Black folks in this universe.
I'd love to sprinkle in one of the stats from our platform, because I think this idea gets me so hot. I have a 5-year-old and 2-year-old, and my 5-year-old is autistic. So this idea of seeing yourself in your teachers, but also in your learning environments, and also in your books is really important for me personally, but also it's important in the classroom because, of course, we all know, and I think Meredith, Dr. Anderson shared this, that the research is really compelling that when students see themselves in their teachers and in their learning environments, so in the books, in the posters, they have more academic gains, they're more likely to graduate. And one platform, this is an older stat, so it's like a few years old, but we actually looked at some research around in schools where 75% or more of the students are Black or Latinx. White teachers and teachers of color were requesting books featuring protagonists of color, so that's great, but the book titles were different. So we're talking about Brown Girl Dreaming and I Love My Hair, making the top 10 books requested across the nation in schools where 75% or more of the kids are Black, versus other book titles not even making the list when the teachers are White. So this idea of teacher diversity and what's taught and the resources in front of you is really, really, really powerful. So this idea of the unique perspective of teachers of color and the power of students seeing themselves in particular resources is just really scary, because we all know what's happening nationwide right now.
Yeah, and picking up on that, I know that Sharif's doing some work on and was talking a little about the social justice aspect of this, and I'd love to hear both from him and from Keeley about some of the research she's done about the unique experience since you're having HBCUs. I think that's part of what we think that there's a potential solution for on how we leverage the HBCU experience and really promote social justice in teaching.
So in teacher education programs, one of the things, in talking with the faculty and staff at our institution, they are explicit in highlighting the impact that Black Americans have had on public education. They talk about, how they literally built America's public education system, and it is centered at these institutions. In addition to that, when talking to the faculty and staff, they highlight the hard work that it takes to prepare the next generation of teachers. And a lot of that is incorporating caring in curriculum and co-curricular activities. And so what caring looks like is the infusion of culturally affirming texts and practices. It also looks like being very strategic, because out of all of the majors that a college or university has, nowhere is the state government more embedded and enmeshed than in teacher education programs. Especially, mind you, these education programs are most are in Republican-led states, right? So for many of these faculty and staff, this is the curriculum, this is what we want you to do, that is all. And so for many of the faculty, they have to embed it into it, right, to ensure that we are meeting the standards, right, but we are affirming our students, but also teaching, preparing them for the students that they are going to serve. And one of the things in talking with the faculty and staff was serving. This is a serving profession, and they made it very, very clear. This is a passion that they have. And so you saw that in a curricular standpoint, and then co-curricular, again, state government is heavily embedded. So many times their hard work was the creation of professional development opportunities outside of the office hours on Saturdays, right? Where they're focusing on the Black child, they're focusing on African American males, so focusing on various demographics to further support and educate their students, but also the community that they work in. So those are just some of the things that.
No, that's a great and I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. Like the government is so deeply embedded. We're in trouble, y'all. But another, I think a part of it is, when you look at how teachers are trained and developed, educators in general, the superintendent, principal, whatever, what they typically learn, if it's not at HBCU, is they learn about white educational theorists, white behavior theorists, white child psychologists. They become enmeshed and scholars or students of Piaget, Freud, Horace Mann, John Dewey, and they never look at what did Dr. Carter G. Woodson say about teaching and learning and the experience that students should receive. What did Lucy Craft Laney and Meredith and their cohort of, if you ever read The Forgotten Sisterhood, those four black women, like just really, did incredible things. How many teacher prep professors know what those four black women did? And what is the black teaching tradition? What's the, you talk about like service, right? Like so when Mary Church Terrell says, well, as educators, we lift as we climb. And if you don't have that kind of context and that perspective, and when I think about Dr. Mark Ryder, a black man who looked at me and said, oh, I see the activism, but I wasn't interested in teaching initially. I wanted to be a lawyer, and said, oh yeah, I'm going to fight for, because that's what I saw. And he helped connect the dots between educational justice and racial justice. But what he said, and I think it's very consistent with HBCUs, is that the purest form of activism is teaching black children well. And if I take that and look at HBCUs, I'm like, oh yeah, that's that same philosophy. So if that is where we are growing and nurturing future educators, then they're going to have that same paradigm and mindset when they enter the pre-K-12 space.
So I know we've got a partnership with Sekou Black.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, and so and we'd love to talk to people more about that. And we talk about some of the things. You've got the UNCF K-12 Education Fellows Program. I love. I'm going to make this the last question for me, and then come to questions from the audience moments. This is the warm up for you all. And just as a quick primer, as you think about your questions, when I turn to the audience for hands for questions, if no hands go up, but people look down, the person looks down, it's called class for Detroit, so just FYI. But I'd love to hear from each of you any thoughts you have on what are other ways that educators and school districts can partner with HBCUs so we can innovate around things that will help get more people into the space, but also get more people into the space who are ready and prepared to help students succeed over the arc of their academic career. Does anyone feel that you go?
So one of the challenges when talking to administrators, the HBCU education administrators, they did not expect the next negative impact of social media on teacher education.
Mm-hmm.
Because a negative viral video will go faster than anything positive, right? And so one of the things that they've been intentional about is providing those, having those events or those programs to provide a different side of what teacher education looks like. Because when they're talking to, incoming students, they're saying, oh, I saw this video, and it's like, well, that's not what teacher education or being a teacher encompasses, right? So a part of recruiting is providing the human capital and the funding, to assist these our institutions in engaging with these students on a personal level to show them of the other side, the positive sides of being a teacher.
And I think, so part of it is being honest, right, with people about what they're getting into when they become a teacher. As you stated, it is a career of passion, right? So it's not always, you're not, like I tell my students all the time, I get paid in pennies, and they think that I'm joking, which I am, but it's not gonna be the most lucrative profession. So you have to take that off the table. Like if you're coming into it for that, and that's not your passion, you have to take that off. And then two, I think, going back to what I said earlier about talking about the importance of Black educators. I changed my major because I heard about the Cradle to Prison pipeline. And if you guys are familiar with that, really dumbing it down is, the U.S. builds prison cells based on third grade math or reading scores. And so basically saying if third grader can't read by the time they're in third grade, they're probably going to end up in prison. And that really affected me. Like I really was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be a third grade teacher and I'm gonna teach every kid that I need to read, and I've never taught third grade, but that was, what got me into it. And I think allowing, peeling back those layers and exposing that and saying, this is why we need you. And then the third thing I would say is to go to the colleges, the HBCUs, the local schools, and bringing people who are in the educator preparation programs in and showing them the real of teaching. I promise you, what I learned at Spelman, and I will never forget, I always value that, but it has nothing in comparison to what I learned on my first year of teaching. There's such a disconnect between what you learn in an education preparation program and what you actually experience day by day. I would rather have PD on the theories and the ideologies than have PD on how do I do this? I need to know how to teach when I walk into that building. I need to know how to connect with my students and what the district is expecting of me and what the school is expecting of me. You get none of that when you're being prepared to be an educator. And so I look to my peers and they're like, I don't have to deal with this. I can make so much more money and work less, work less than having to, because it's a lot of work. I know what you're saying about the negative side, and I hate when people do that, they only do the dirty laundry, but teaching is a lot of work, especially now. It's so different the way that parents raise their kids now and the way that you're able to relate to children and the things that you can do. And my principal looks at me crazy when I tell her I take kids home, right? Because that's a huge no-no now, because there's so many things that parents can say, but I do it because that's how I connect with my students. But it's just, people need to know what they're getting themselves into and be prepared for that and understand that your reward comes from the activism that you're doing through your classroom. You may not be picketing and you may not be, on the steps of DC, but you are changing the lives of students every day. And that is just as important as, being that lawyer, being that activist. So that's what
I don't know how to follow that. I guess what's that? HBCU educated teachers, we need more of them in the classroom, and college is expensive. And teaching doesn't, I don't even know if the first year in teaching equals the amount of, if you probably took loans out, it might actually just, it might actually come right out here.
Let me solve that for you.
So I would add, when teachers get in the classroom, wrap your arms around them, give them the resources they need so they're not coming out of pocket. So it's a little cheesy that I'm come to DonorsChoose, but really, use resources that are rallying dollars around classrooms so that teachers are not spending $1 out of their own pockets, because that is a big deterrent, I would say, for someone graduating from an HBCU and saying, I can't afford to teach the nation's next generation.
Well, on that point, actually, Sharif, you want to tell everybody a little bit about the work that we're doing together? Because it impacts the millions of dollars.
No, No, absolutely, and I think it touches on a lot of what my fellow panelists mentioned earlier about that early exposure clinical experiences. And so, our primary work is to rebuild the Black teacher pipeline, a pipeline that's highly effective, sustainable, and predictable for high school students. And so, students who go through our teacher apprenticeship, which is a paid apprenticeship, high school students, both in person in Philly, Camden, and Detroit, but virtually. I think last year we had 16 states represented. But if they go through this program, they're eligible to apply to this Black Teacher Pipeline Fellowship that in partnership with UNCF, where they get, it's basically a $40,000 investment, $20,000 last dollar scholarship, and then $20,000 retention bonuses once they start teaching. But in between there, it's not just a scholarship, we don't call it that. It's a fellowship in partnership with UNCF using, UNCF is like, I don't know if people recognize like just the depth of.
Tell them all about it.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's like the research and the practice, and not just theory, right? Like you mentioned, like not just theory about things that they've actually done, witnessed, modeled, supported, right? Like it is such a treasure trove. And so we wanted to partner with an organization like that. And so UNCF was obviously the no-brainer, but to be able to have students go through a fellowship that's meaningful, that includes mentorship, support, as well as the scholarship dollars. Not just, hey, here's some money and you're on your own. But that's not traditionally what works in our community. We're communal people, and so we go together. And this fellowship that we have with UNCF represents us going together, that lift as we climb, as Mary Church Terrell said. So, the opportunity to have that clinical experience that's paid, last dollar scholarship, and then knowing, hey, I may not start off with a salary that's commensurate with the work, but I have a little bit of a retention bonus. So if I leave college debt-free as much as close as possible, and then a little bump, and as far as like, and you have to reach certain, milestones, getting certified, finishing a year, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of your 4th year, and you get this, it's released to you, but you're able to see it because it's in your name, right? And so you're able to see like, oh, I finished my 2nd year, I got, 10,000, and then, but you can't touch it, but you see it and like give somebody, just that opportunity to be able to just see themselves leading in classroom and conveying this is the most important thing that we need in our community.
I think that's absolutely right. So let's open up to our audience members' questions. So, and yes.
So I work with Keeley, and I was wondering, when I think of like strengthening the Black educator pipeline, how do you feel about the historical perspective, like Sonia Moore's first book, Learning in a Burning Building? She talks about how integration changed the trajectory of like Black superintendents, Black principals being pushed out of school districts and schools. How important is that history for bringing a new generation of teachers, Black teachers, back into the pipeline and strengthening that pipeline? For them to know that they have a history and legacy, like you talked about, of having Black educators that have always been in community and felt that that was a vocation that had a purpose.
You would be in trouble. Integration solved everything, girl.
Yeah, my take is, look, the best thing you can do for everybody is be like as brutally honest as possible. Like, now that includes, right? Being honest includes, and I think this is, my takeaway from my experience as a student at Morehouse is teaching young people things that if you don't teach them, nobody else will. Because that's part of what the underlying challenge, and I think part of what the underlying premise of the solution here is, the more young people we can bring into safe, nurturing environments, HBCUs, teach them about all the things they need to know, including the things that apparently people have been actively trying to keep away from them, because those things affirm them, strengthen them, like put them in a position to feel like I'm going to do my job, but I'm also going to help my students like aspire to do and be more, because this is actually like they're worthy of it, and it's in their tradition to have it. Because I do think that's part of the challenge, right? A lot of young people don't realize there's a history of a great many of these things. I think, like for me growing up, part of the experience was like, yeah, I should be able to do all this because like I've seen people doing this before, but a lot of students have not. I think that's part of what we want to make sure is happening is put them in places where people are going to tell you about all the things you're capable of and all the things like you and your people have actually already done. Not like it's some mythical, possible, it's like, no, people did that before. People have just been trying to make sure you don't know about it.
Yeah. And when you're looking at the curriculum, and faculty were describing what they were doing, it's laying it on thick, right, about the impact that Black Americans have had on public education, and clearly like identifying what tactics were being used and what the things that they did in order to create those teachers, you know, and also the advocacy, the impact that these teachers had in social justice and advocacy for, you know, Black Americans. So making them aware of, you know, like we are public education. That's it, right? And so, you know, recognizing that impact is incredible for any Black freshman or Black non-traditional teacher education major to know that you built this. That's literally what happened, you know? And so that really helps just confidence and just affirming who they are, who we are as Black people.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical to teach truth, and no matter where you are. I think it's important, you know, once there's a narrative in anywhere, but you know, America has a very particular narrative that it wants to portray, and so we celebrate things like Brown versus Ford without, you know, we want to flatten everything, without, you know, and the idea of an educator is to like uplift, right? So the Black Panther Party, the chairman Fred Hampton used to say, you know, elevate the inconsistencies. So what's inconsistent about Brown versus Ford? What happened as a result of that? You know, and letting students know, like, yeah, almost 40,000 Black educators lost their jobs, were, you know, demoted, laid off, outright fired. You were a principal, now you can hire because you're a janitor. Let's talk about why they accepted Black children. You know, was it because they just loved Black children and felt like, you know, they saw the light and wanted to do right by them? Or was it like, oh, federal dollars are tied to the, you know, my friend Chris Stewart said Black children was the new cop. And so that was this way to continue to make money off of it. Like, all right, because some said, like, forget it, we don't want your money, federal government, we're going to shut down. I was like, yeah, we'll take the money because it's tied to that Black child. But there ain't no money tied to that Black teacher, so we ain't taking that. And so making sure that we are continuing to teach accurate history as a part of not only, you know, educating, but activating our Black youth, and for that matter, America as well. You know, even Dr. King, when they talk, you know, a lot of times people are shocked because I would tell them, like, you know, Dr. King said, yeah, all this integration. I'm talking about public spaces where our tax dollars go to. Don't take our tax money and then say we can't use that bathroom, or can't sit here, or can't do that. And he told Black teachers, don't give up, don't send students to people who don't look at them as whole. Now, why is that erased? That should be on Martin Luther King Day. He said, y'all can't teach our kids. Put that on, you know, put that on the tagline, you know, so, yeah.
So, Ms. Haywood?
Yes.
Mentioned the theory of teacher prep. You know, that you learn theory and all of these things, and not how to be first aid ready. So education is constantly changing. 10 years later, ed prep is still 20th century curriculum. To the panel, I'd like to know, based on your research, what you found in the various studies, what would you recommend teacher ed programs do to not continue the 20th century, but to move us ahead with our mantra still on our shoulders?
So that's the difficult part. So our institutions are doing that, but again, the state is so, like, when I was talking to one of the deans of education, y'all, like the level of engagement that they have with the commissioner of education, the level of engagement that they have, it's a marriage, right? And so for many of our teacher education programs, it's like chess. right? Where it's kind of like, okay, we have Kim and Georgia. He is against critical race theory. It is evident. So it may look like, okay, we might not say it CRT, but what if I hired someone with a background in African American studies or with the background or research in critical race theory, right? So you can do it, you know, but listen, you know, it's a lot of negotiation that they have to do. So it's happening, the innovations are happening, but from us, you know, as citizens, the poll is so important when it comes to the level of impact it has on our public education system, right? So that way, you know, our teacher education programs have the autonomy that that they need, you know, to fully fully embed it into their curriculum. But again, it's very, very, very meshed. So our institutions are incorporating it in various different ways on a daily basis. But, you know, again, the state is heavily involved.
I would add to that this idea of, you know, I think you got to be creative and forward thinking. And, you know, it's unfortunate a lot of folks in the ebony and ivory towers think they know everything. And some of them, I've met several who've never even stepped foot in a school. You know, and as far as the leadership, and how are you really preparing, right? Like, and so when Brian Stevenson talked about proximity, that ain't just for criminal justice, that's for you too. As you know, you're working in a college, and you don't know what it's like to lead a fourth grade classroom or lead that school space. And so I think a part of it is like, how are they partnering with pre-K-12? Right now it's a lot of just finger pointing and blaming. Pre-K-12 blames higher ed blames pre-K-12, and right, like it's just this cycle. But how are you partnering? I remember as a principal, we partnered with Drexel University for some things. We partnered with Cheney for some things where they were coming in, right? Because then it was more like action research. Don't just talk it, does it work with these students in this space and seeing that, right? And so then the professional development is tied also to the work that's being done. Like, okay, can I actually implement this theory in practice, and what does it look like? And so then that professor is also learning as well, like, oh, you know, that might not happen for, you know, a knowledge-rich generation that can find, but like, what are the other things they need to apply all the information they have access to? I think things like residencies, and there's a couple universities in the Philly area, their adjunct professors are majority actual teachers. So they're not removed from the practice, they're teaching, and then a couple days a week, they're doing the adjunct professor, right? Like, again, another way to supplement income, but it's also there informing the university of, here's what it looks like right now.
I just would say, I think that's, to me, that's the answer is, I think as teachers. I think teachers as experts is something that we are learning. I think a lot of parents in the pandemic were like, these teachers are amazing. Your kids are home, you're like, how do they do this? And so I think there really is power in at scale. And I think I heard someone here is from the Department of Education, so federal level, they can't actually just learning across the nation, like what can our teachers tell us? Like what expertise can we just simply pose to learn? Like how do we reform ed prep? Let's ask the teachers what they need.
Absolutely. And I would also venture to say building relationships with those teachers that you're placing your students with, right? So I had a student teacher during the pandemic who was from Spelman, and the way that I got her was because I went to Spelman, right? And so I went through that program, they reached out, they said, would you like a student teacher? And with my relationship with the person who was heading the department, I let her know, like, she's gonna be teaching from day one because that's what I needed. But I had that relationship with them. And so I look at another teacher who had a student teacher from, I want to say it was West Georgia. She knew nothing about West Georgia or their program, and the student teacher came in, and it was a hard marriage to make in that classroom, especially because the teacher had no idea what West Georgia was looking for. You give them a list, but it's like, what is it that you really want this person to learn while they're under my tutelage in this classroom? And so I think it's very important to create relationships with the teachers that you're asking to be cooperating teachers. I know Spelman reaches out to me almost every month. Do you want to sit on this panel? Do you want to sit in this discussion? Do you want to be a mentor? You know what I mean? Building that relationship with me so that one, they know who they're putting their students in front of, and then two, I'm so invested in the work that they're doing that it's going to show through the way I prepare the student teacher in my classroom.
Yeah. And if I could just add just one piece, I think a part of, like the Inclusa Saba if more of these, if that lived in the educational ecosystem a little bit more, right? That particularly collective work and responsibility. Now, which is to add collective work and responsibility and accountability. Like, what does it mean for a university who's preparing teachers to feel like, I'm accountable for how effective students are, and shrinking the chasm between that, right? It's like, oh no, it's not just who's in front of me, but the impact that they have. I want to take ownership of it, right? I want to make sure, like, that student is having it. And sometimes you see, higher ed shrinking away from that and saying, well, that's not our day. We handed it off. There's no handoff in the education ecosystem. We are all forever linked. And so if we can shrink that a little bit. I gave a commencement speech for a College of Ed, and I was speaking to the students about, like, these graduates, that the students that you have will know if you had, if you got new glasses, if you got new hairdo, new pocketbook. Don't make it create an environment where they know that, but they can't tell that you are taking a master's course in something. So you joined a book club, or you got a new banner or a sticker for the back of your car about Black Lives Matter. They should know that. And a professor came up to me like, oh, I never thought about that. If my class is working, I should be able to survey the students. Or I'm like, what have you been doing the past 20-something years? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Right? So, it's just like that disconnect, I think. If we can address that, I think we'll go a long way, much faster.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So we've got 5 minutes. I know we've got one question we want to do here, and then I'm going to ask our panelists to chime in on the question, and also on your way out of the response to the question, give us any thoughts on ways people can learn more about your work or connect with your organization going forward. So, final question.
Yeah, so at the beginning you all talked about the stats about 7% they teach K-12 are black teachers, and then the 11% black principals, correct? But also, black teachers have one of the highest turnover rates, right? I want you all to speak to the responsibility of the black principals for capacity building of those black teachers under their leadership.
I don't know if you guys want me to
Why
talk
you
about
got to
that.
answer a question like that?
You can always default to what I say for parting thoughts on the way out.
I'm the person. I don't want to get out here. Anybody else?
I would just say, I know I'm coming with all these stats, but you are so onto something, because as of 2021, in that survey that we did together, black teachers have all actually were the first to say, and we did this across looking at the racial identity and gender identity, even like looking at matching of their principal, were still the most likely to say, and it was twice as likely that they're leaving their profession faster than all the other identities. So I have zero solutions outside of, yes, it is still a problem, and we try to control for, well, what about when there's a principal of color or a black principal, and the answer was still the same. So there is something to this capacity.
I definitely think you're onto something. I can speak from my personal experience. So I work at a school that opened 6 years ago, and I've been there since the opening. So I've been able to see people come in, start their teaching experience with us. And I have this yearly debate with my assistant principal and principal that it is their responsibility to teach new teachers what they're supposed to be doing. And they're from, they're old school, so they're like, no, like, you should know, like, when I was at college, they told us do this, and I was like, it's not the same. Like, it is your responsibility to tell them, to teach them the game, but then not only that, but to have them be thought partners. Because if you tell me that I'm valuable, right, and that my presence matters, but then you hand me a script of what I'm supposed to do, and I can't, leave that script, there's a disconnect. And the teachers that are coming now, so I'll give you guys some background. My husband's a teacher, he's 3 years younger than I am. I will FaceTime him maybe during my lunch, and he'll be in the classroom and playing music and his student, and I'm like, what are you doing? That's not how I was prepared to be a teacher, but it works. He is connecting with his students. He brought me back his test scores, and I was like, my goodness, he's a 4th-year teacher, but almost 100% of his students passed the Georgia milestones, and it's because of his relationship with his students. It's not because he teaches small group algebra, which is special ed. So it has nothing to do with I wouldn't say the way that he's teaching, but it's all about that relationship and how he connects. But that was also passed down to him from his principal. Because when you walk into his school, his principal's office is in the hallway. And students are coming up to him and he's, they're not necessarily dressed exactly the same, but they're dressed alike. And they can have conversation and they have access to the principal. At our school, I kid you not, I've heard so many students ask if I was the principal or if my colleague was the principal. They don't see my principal, she doesn't come out. And so there is a huge need, I think, for once somebody reaches that position, for them to be brought into professional development that shows them what having character as a principal or assistant principal looks like, what it means to pass that baton, to, like he said, to take that responsibility. You've achieved this, right? And there are other people who are trying to achieve it. What are you doing to keep people in this profession so that they can get there? It is not, I tell people all the time, you don't have to unscrew someone else's light bulb for you to shine. So it's not, I gotta keep people down so that I can keep my position, but what can I do to reach back to prepare these teachers to take over when I'm ready to leave, or even not even take over, but to have their own. And so I think that there's a lot of misconception about competition in Black education, and I think that people think that once you achieve a certain level that you don't need any more professional development, and I think that that's the opposite, actually.
Oh, somebody quoted her and tweeted that out. I think it's a two-pronged approach. I think it's extremely important. I think one, I was a principal for 16 years, and I still remember other principals when I first made the transition telling me, keep your head down, you need to tone it down, stop being, you're not an activist, you're a principal. And I thought, and these were Black principals, mind you, and I thought, like, wow, how scarred must they be because they were saying that out of love, right? Like, not out of jealousy or competition. They were saying out of love, like, young man, like, listen, you got a lot of, bright future. We don't want you to get in trouble. And I was like, I can't do that, right? But, but I recognize, like, what they were dealing with. So I think one is around principal support so that they can lead with authenticity and both the humility and courage necessary to do the work and support teachers. And I think the other thing is making sure that they're aware of, like, who they're hiring, how to support. We wrote a while ago, wrote a blog about, principals. If you're hiring and not asking about race, class, power, privilege, then the odds are you're not supporting the teachers and creating an ecosystem, right, of those anti-racist colleagues, necessary. Because a whole lot of folks are talking about, it ain't even the money that's making folks leave. It's like, I got anti-Black colleagues and supervisors. And then the other piece, we wrote a teacher retention toolkit that's specifically for, like, we didn't write it just for principals. We wrote it for leadership teams, because a principal can't be everywhere, so what's the ecosystem within the school? Principal supervisors, so less of them will go around to the school and say, your bulletin board is raggedy, and actually give real professional development. And then HR and talent, because if that Black teacher says, hey, I'm having trouble, and they're not saying, oh, you're just being overly sensitive, and everything's not about race. You made everything about race. We're trying to make everything about humanity. And so those are the three groups that we wrote the retention toolkit. And it's like open source, and people are using it to develop their leadership teams, develop the ecosystem necessary. And then lastly, you asked, like, how does the Entitled, say, one grad, my colleague Mimi Johannes back there, but then also follow the hashtag We Need Black Teachers, as well as same as the website We Need Black Teachers, which came from high school students, by the way. That's the, I thought they were going to come up with something gimmicky and all that, TikTok smoke and skits, and they're like, no, we want people to know straight shooter, like, this is what we want. As a matter of fact, this is what we're demanding. That we need hashtag We Need Black Teachers. So that's the website that's kind of really uplifting their voice and amplifying. So.
Yeah, and I just add, I think there's always a tricky thing here, right? Because we know, like, we need more Black teachers, right? And we know we need more Black institutions to do more. And then we get caught in this dynamic where we demand more, of the people and institutions that have the least, right? Which starts with that. And so I think we have to be forceful about saying, like, we need these things. We also need, like, the resources, which include the flexibility and the freedom to do what needs to be done. And so I definitely find myself, like, trying to avoid the trap of, well, now that we have a black principal, like, demand they do all, like, well, yeah, we can demand all those things, but we better show up and figure out a way to give them the things they need to get the job done. So I think we've got to build more on that foundation. So, you know, what are the partnerships and what are the ways to, you know, support people in their journey? Because one thing is true, and I want to be, like, really honest about this, like, black teachers, black principals, like, being black in America is still hard. And so we ask people who already have it hard in the world to do a hard job and then don't do things to make it marginally easier. I think we have to chip away at, you know, what are the foundations and supports that we can give them to make it marginally easier. And I think the reason why I personally believe that is, so, yesterday I got a Facebook message from my 7th and 8th grade English language arts teacher about something she saw that one of my kids had done, and how excited she was to see it, and how proud, you know, my wife and I went to school together, so she knew us both, how proud we must be of him, and how proud she was of us, right? And it's like, yeah, you know, she was my teacher, like, in 1983, right? But felt compelled because of, like, this community that we're a part of, and I want us to have more of that for more students. Because I think you go back to the stats that Meredith talked about, like putting more teachers that are secure in this is about not just simply my day, but like my being a part of this community has sort of untold upward impact on students. And I think we haven't built enough of the mechanism machinery yet. We need more of the pathways and the partnerships and the opportunities. I think that's why we want to share some things that these different organizations are doing now. I think there's a lot more to do, and I think, you know, we're looking forward to hearing from all of you in various ways, like other ways that we can innovate on this, because I think we need to do more and better. We look forward to that, and to how you connect and learn more. We've obviously got information here on how to stay in touch with us, and it looks like Keeley's got one more thing to say.
And teacher education programs are recognizing the need, and so when the funding is essential, but when they are writing grants, they are particularly for recruitment purposes. A part of it is we're going to train you to become teachers, but we're also going to provide funding for support in your first couple of years. You know, so that way, from an institution perspective, you know, we can't necessarily control what happens outside, but when we are designing the grants and we're designing our program, if there's any way that we can provide some type of financial support or a group or a support group or something like that, where, okay, you graduate from our institution, you can I still want you to come back and just talk about your experience to provide the professional development within those first couple of years of the teacher education, of becoming a teacher. So those are some programming that is being implemented at our institutions to help in that process.
Y'all, this has been an amazing session. I want to give it up for our panelists. Any questions? I know we need a little bit more, so just feel free to kind of mix and mingle, but we got to head out for lunch, okay?
Can I just say something first before we leave the lunch? I can't let this opportunity get away from me. I am Dr. Vicki Robinson. I am with the U.S. Department of Education. I am the director of HBCU or PDI programs. This is hot off the press, so we do have a program that will be announced this summer called the Augustus F. Hawkins program. Just remember Hawkins program, and it's to improve the number and increase the number of teachers of color. You guys may be familiar with the program we had last year that focused more on black male teachers. This will focus on teachers of color, HBCUs, minority serving institutions, and tribal colleges. And you can reach out to me for more information. So your name again? Vicki, V-I-C-K-I. V is in victory, V-I-C-K-I, Robinson. So it's Vicki.Robinson@ed.gov.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I know.
I gotta tell you about the money.
Feel free to mix and mingle, and you can head out for lunch. We'll open the doors.